There is a throne in the deepest chamber of your mind. You've been building it since childhood, stone by stone, hour by hour, with trembling hands and unrelenting focus. It gleams in the darkness, crystalline and perfect, catching reflections of who you might become, if only you could reach it. You've been told this throne is your destiny, your worthiness made manifest. You've been taught that sitting upon it will finally make you whole. But here's what no one tells you. The throne is made of glass, and you've been cutting yourself on its edges your entire life. Welcome. Welcome to a journey that will take us into one of the most pervasive, most insidious, and least understood forces shaping modern consciousness. We are here to explore perfectionism, not as a personality quirk or an admirable trait, but as a tyranny. A hidden dictatorship that rules from within, demanding blood sacrifice in exchange for the illusion of control, the mirage of worth, the phantom promise that one day, if you just try hard enough, you will finally be enough. This is not a story about setting high standards. This is a story about the slow suffocation of the soul beneath impossible ones. This is about the voice that whispers in the dead of night, not good enough, never good enough. You are one mistake away from worthlessness. This is about the ancient human need for belonging transformed into a prison. This is about evolutionary survival mechanisms twisted into weapons of self-destruction. This is about the collision between who we are and who we believe we must become to deserve love, success, safety, existence itself. Imagine, if you will, a civilization that built its towers so high they pierced the clouds. A people so obsessed with reaching the heavens that they forgot the earth beneath their feet. They built and built and built, each generation adding another floor, another impossible height, until the entire structure trembled with the weight of its own ambition. And then, one day, a child at the base of the tower looked up and asked a simple question. But why? Why indeed? Why do we chase the unreachable? Why do we construct elaborate scaffolding around our worth, making it conditional on achievements that can never satisfy? Why do we treat ourselves with a cruelty we would never inflict upon another human being? Why have we, as a species that evolved through cooperation and connection, learned to wage war against ourselves? The answer lies deeper than you might imagine. Deeper than your last failed project or your latest self-criticism. Deeper than your childhood, though it begins there. Deeper than your culture, though it feeds there. The roots of perfectionism reach into the very architecture of consciousness itself, into the way awareness relates to existence, into the fundamental human terror of insignificance, into the primal wound of separation that occurred when the first human being looked at their reflection and realized they were observing themselves. In the next 2 hours, we will descend together into the labyrinth of perfectionism. We will trace its origins from the moment consciousness split itself into observer and observed. We will walk through the gardens of ancient philosophy where the seeds of impossible standards were first planted. We will stand in the laboratories of modern psychology as neuroscientists map the neural pathways of self-criticism. We will witness the ways technology and social media have weaponized our ancestral need for belonging, turning it into an engine of perpetual inadequacy. We will explore the paradox at the heart of perfectionism, that it promises control but delivers chaos, promises excellence but ensures paralysis, promises worthiness but guarantees shame. We will examine how perfectionism masquerades as ambition, discipline, and care, all while slowly bleeding us dry. But most importantly, we will discover the way out. Because here's what I can promise you. By the end of this journey, you will understand perfectionism not as your enemy, but as a symptom, a messenger, a scared, wounded part of your psyche that has been trying, in the only way it knows how, to keep you safe. And once you understand its language, once you see through its illusions, once you recognize the tyranny for what it is, you will be free to choose differently. You will learn that excellence and perfectionism are not the same thing, that growth and punishment are not synonymous, that worthiness is not something you earn, but something you are, that the throne you've been building your entire life was unnecessary from the beginning, because you were never meant to sit above your humanity. You were meant to live within it. This is the story of how we became strangers to ourselves, and how we might, if we're brave enough, find our way home. The glass throne awaits, but so does something far more precious, your liberation. Let us begin. Act 1. The Origins. When consciousness learned to condemn itself, the first wound, the birth of self-awareness. To understand perfectionism, we must first understand a moment that occurred somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, a moment so profound that it split reality in two. This was the moment when a primate, standing on the African savanna, looked at its own hand and recognized for the first time that it was looking, the moment consciousness became aware of itself. Before this moment, existence simply was. An animal doesn't judge its hunger or critique its fear. A tree doesn't compare itself to other trees. The river doesn't worry whether it's flowing perfectly enough. There is being and there is doing, but there is no observer standing apart, measuring, judging, finding fault. But with self-awareness came something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, the ability to imagine how things could be different. And with that ability came something darker, the capacity to measure the distance between what is and what should be. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, hamartia. It's often translated as tragic flaw, but its original meaning is far more precise. It means to miss the mark. An archer releases an arrow, and it veers slightly off course, the gap between intention and reality, the space where judgment lives. When consciousness learned to observe itself, it also learned to evaluate itself, and in that evaluation, in that gap between actual and ideal, perfectionism found its first home. Picture, if you will, that early human, not yet speaking complex languages, but already carrying the weight of self-consciousness. They make a tool, a hand axe perhaps, and for the first time in history, they don't just use it. They look at it. They notice the rough edges, the asymmetries, and somewhere in their newly expanded brain, a comparison forms. This could be better. This capacity, this ability to envision improvement is not the problem. This is the engine of human progress. This is what would eventually build civilizations, compose symphonies, decode the genome, send machines to other planets. The ability to imagine beyond what is, to reach for what could be, is among the most beautiful capacities of the human mind. But something else happened in that moment, something more subtle and far more dangerous. Along with "this could be better" came another thought. I could be better. And then inevitably, I should be better. And finally, until I am better, I am not enough. The arrow had missed the mark, and consciousness learned to aim that arrow at itself, the temple and the mirror, ancient perfectionism. Fast forward several millennia. The year is approximately 400 BCE, and we find ourselves in ancient Athens, in the Academy of Plato. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, a radical philosophy is taking shape, one that would echo through centuries and fundamentally reshape how humans understand reality, goodness, and their own nature. Plato proposed something extraordinary, that the physical world we inhabit is merely shadow, a degraded copy of a perfect realm of forms that exists beyond perception. Somewhere beyond the reach of our senses, there exists the perfect circle, the perfect triangle, the perfect horse, the perfect human being. Everything we encounter in our daily lives is, by definition, a flawed approximation of these transcendent ideals. Think about what this means for the human psyche. It means that imperfection is not circumstantial, it's cosmological. It's written into the very fabric of existence. You are, by the nature of being physical and temporal, necessarily and eternally falling short of what you could be. The gap between actual and ideal is not a temporary condition to be fixed, but an existential reality to be endured. Aristotle, Plato's student, would later modify this framework, arguing that perfection could be achieved through the cultivation of virtue and the realization of one's potential, what he called eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. But even this more earthbound philosophy contained within it a seed of perfectionism, the idea that there is a proper way to be human, a correct unfolding of potential, and that falling short of this represents not just failure, but a kind of moral deficiency. Meanwhile, across the ancient world, other traditions were wrestling with similar questions through different lenses. In India, the concept of karma suggested that present circumstances reflect past actions, creating an elaborate system of cause and effect that spans lifetimes. In China, Confucianism established rigorous codes of proper conduct, defining the gentleman, Junzi, according to exacting standards of behavior, ritual, and moral cultivation. Each tradition, in its way, mapped the territory between human and ideal, between what we are and what we might become, and each, despite their wisdom and insight, carried within them the potential for a punishing relationship with imperfection. But it was perhaps in the Abrahamic traditions that perfectionism would find its most psychologically potent expression. Consider the Garden of Eden, humanity's origin story as one of fundamental failure. Adam and Eve, created perfect, commit the original sin of disobedience. They reach for knowledge, for godhood, and are cast out. The message embedded in this mythology runs deep. Humans are born into a state of wrongness. We are inherently flawed, stained, unworthy. Redemption is possible, but it requires perfect adherence to divine law, perfect faith, perfect submission. The New Testament would intensify this dynamic. Jesus himself commands, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Not do your best or grow gradually, but be perfect. Measure yourself against the infinite. Bridge the unbridgeable gap. The psychological implications are staggering. When perfection becomes not just an ideal but a moral and spiritual obligation, imperfection becomes not just unfortunate but shameful, sinful, proof of unworthiness. The gap between actual and ideal is no longer merely disappointing, it's evidence of fundamental corruption. The Reformation and the rise of the inner tyrant. Let us travel forward to 16th century Europe, to the moment when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. The Protestant Reformation was, among many things, a revolution in the relationship between individual and divine authority. No longer would priests mediate between believers and God. Each person would have direct access to Scripture, direct responsibility for their salvation. But with this liberation came a new burden, the internalization of judgment. The Catholic confessional had externalized moral accounting. You confessed to a priest, received absolution, and were released. But Protestantism, particularly in its Calvinist expressions, moved the entire apparatus of judgment inside the individual psyche. The concept of predestination added another layer of terror. Your salvation or damnation was already decided by God, but you didn't know which. So how could you tell if you were among the elect? By examining your life for signs of grace. By measuring your actions, your thoughts, your very being against impossible standards of purity and righteousness. By searching ceaselessly for evidence that you were worthy. This created what psychologists would later call hypervigilant introspection, a constant, exhausting surveillance of the self. Every thought became suspect. Every action required examination. Every pleasure invited guilt. The mind turned inward and became its own prison warden. The historian Max Weber would later identify how this Protestant ethic fused with the emerging spirit of capitalism, creating the psychological foundations for modernity itself. Productivity became virtue, idleness became sin, success became evidence of worth. The individual became an enterprise, responsible for optimizing every aspect of existence. What we're tracing here is a progression, a gradual tightening of the noose. Consciousness becomes self-aware. Philosophy elevates the ideal above the real. Religion weaponizes imperfection as sin. Industrialization transforms humans into units of production. And slowly, invisibly, a structure crystallizes in the human mind. A voice that measures, judges, condemns. A voice that speaks with the authority of parents, teachers, priests, culture itself, but has taken up residence inside your skull. This voice has a name. Carl Jung called it the critic. Freud called it the superego. Modern psychology calls it the inner critic. But regardless of the terminology, its function is the same, to maintain an impossible standard and punish any deviation. And here's the cruelest irony. This voice often presents itself as helpful. It claims to be protecting you, motivating you, keeping you safe. It says, if I'm harsh enough, you'll finally get it right. If I criticize you enough, you'll become worthy. If I never let you rest, you'll never fail. But what it actually does is ensure you live in a permanent state of inadequacy, always reaching for a horizon that recedes with every step, always measuring yourself against a standard that was never meant for human beings in the first place. The industrial machine, manufacturing perfectionism. Now let us leap forward to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, to the moment when human life began to synchronize with the rhythms of machinery. Picture the factory floor, the assembly line, the time clock. Picture Frederick Winslow Taylor with his stopwatch, measuring every movement of every worker, seeking the one best way to perform each task. Scientific management, he called it. The optimization of human labor. What happened in those factories was more than economic transformation. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it means to be human. Workers were no longer craftspeople with individual styles and rhythms. They were interchangeable parts in a larger mechanism, valued only for their efficiency, their consistency, their ability to eliminate variation. Variation, that is, the natural diversity of human capacity, energy, and circumstance, became the enemy. Standardization became the goal. And slowly, the logic of the machine infiltrated the logic of identity. You were only as valuable as your output. Rest was waste. Uniqueness was inefficiency. Your worth could be measured, quantified, compared. This mechanistic view of humanity found its ultimate expression in the 20th century's twin obsessions: productivity and comparison. The assembly line created the first true mass production, which created mass consumption, which created advertising, which created the perpetual sense that you need to be different, better, newer, more perfect than you currently are. And then came the truly revolutionary development, the ability to measure and compare not just products and workers, but individuals themselves. Standardized testing, academic rankings, performance reviews, metrics cascading through every domain of life. And with each measurement, each ranking, each comparison, the message internalized: you are not enough. Someone is doing it better. You're falling behind. By the mid-20th century, perfectionism had evolved from a philosophical concept to a cultural epidemic, woven into the very fabric of how modern societies operate. The psychologist Karen Horney, writing in the 1950s, described what she called the tyranny of the should, the way people created internal demands that had no basis in their actual values, desires, or capacities, but reflected instead what they believed they must be to deserve love and respect. Her colleague, Albert Ellis, would later develop rational emotive behavior therapy, partly in response to what he saw as a culture of irrational perfectionism, people destroying their mental health over imaginary standards, treating preferences as absolute necessities, turning disappointment into catastrophe. But perhaps no one captured the psychological mechanism of perfectionism more precisely than the researcher Paul Hewitt and his colleagues, who in the 1990s identified three distinct dimensions of perfectionism: self-oriented perfectionism, setting impossibly high standards for yourself; other-oriented perfectionism, demanding perfection from others; socially prescribed perfectionism, believing that others expect perfection from you. It's this third dimension, socially prescribed perfectionism, that has exploded in recent decades, particularly among younger generations. And its rise correlates precisely with increases in anxiety, depression, and suicide. The data is unambiguous and chilling. The more people believe they must be perfect to be accepted, the more they suffer. What began as consciousness becoming self-aware has culminated in consciousness becoming self-destroying, turning its greatest gift, the ability to imagine better, into a weapon of relentless judgment. We have built our glass throne, and we are bleeding. But to understand how we might free ourselves, we must first descend deeper into the labyrinth. We must understand not just the history of perfectionism, but its psychological architecture, the precise mechanisms by which it hijacks the mind and holds it hostage. We must understand the tyranny itself. The perfectionist's paradox: control through chaos. Here is the central paradox of perfectionism. It promises control but delivers the opposite. It emerges from a desperate attempt to manage the unmanageable uncertainty of existence, but it creates an internal chaos so profound that it can destroy the very life it seeks to perfect. To understand this paradox, we need to understand fear. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a vast, dark forest. You cannot see what lies within. You know that dangers exist, predators, pitfalls, poison. Your survival depends on navigating this forest, but its complexity overwhelms you. You cannot predict every outcome. You cannot prepare for every possibility. You are vulnerable, finite, mortal. This is the human condition. We live in radical uncertainty. Every choice branches into infinite consequences we cannot foresee. Every relationship might end in abandonment. Every success might collapse into failure. Every moment of health contains the seed of illness. We walk through the forest blindfolded, and the darkness terrifies us. Perfectionism offers a solution. If you could just be perfect, perfect enough in your preparation, your performance, your presentation, you could eliminate uncertainty. You could control outcomes. You could guarantee safety. Perfectionism promises that flawlessness is a form of armor, protection against the chaos of existence. But here's what actually happens. The perfectionist becomes so focused on avoiding mistakes that they cannot move. They spend so much energy managing minutiae that they miss the larger landscape. They become rigid when they need flexibility, frozen when they need flow. The very attempt to control everything guarantees that nothing can be controlled. Let me paint you a picture of how this plays out in a human life. Meet Sarah, a composite character, but one whose story reflects millions of real experiences. Sarah is brilliant, accomplished, admired. She was the perfect student, straight A's, valedictorian, scholarship to a prestigious university. She graduated summa cum laude. She landed a job at a top firm. By every external measure, she is successful. But Sarah has not slept properly in 5 years. She spends hours perfecting emails that could be written in minutes. She checks and rechecks her work obsessively, terrified of the smallest error. She cancels social engagements to perfect presentations that are already excellent. She has dreams where she's standing naked in front of a crowd, her every flaw exposed and judged. Her relationships suffer. She criticizes her partner for not loading the dishwasher correctly. She can't accept compliments because they don't align with her harsh self-assessment. She avoids trying new things because the learning curve means visible imperfection. Her life is shrinking, contracting into smaller and smaller spaces where she feels she can maintain control. And the cruelest part? Sarah knows, intellectually, that this is irrational. She can see that her standards are unrealistic. She wouldn't judge others the way she judges herself. But knowing doesn't stop the mechanism. The tyranny operates below the level of reason, in the ancient territories of the brain where fear and survival live. This is the perfectionist's paradox in action. The attempt to control leads to chaos. The attempt to perfect leads to paralysis. The attempt to become worthy leads to a perpetual sense of worthlessness. The neuroscience of never enough. Your brain on perfectionism. Let us descend now into the biological substrate of consciousness itself, into the 3 pounds of electrochemical complexity that generate your subjective experience of reality. Because perfectionism is not merely a psychological phenomenon, it has a neurology. It leaves physical traces in the architecture of the brain. When neuroscientists examine the brains of individuals with perfectionist tendencies using fMRI scanners, certain patterns emerge consistently. First, there's heightened activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in error detection and conflict monitoring. This is the part of your brain that screams "wrong" when you make a mistake. In perfectionists, it's hyperactive, finding errors everywhere, generating a constant alarm signal that floods consciousness with anxiety. Second, there's often reduced activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-compassion, self-acceptance, and the ability to contextualize mistakes. It's as if the voice of kindness has been dimmed, while the voice of criticism has been amplified to deafening volume. Third, and perhaps most significantly, perfectionism activates the brain's threat detection circuitry, the amygdala and associated structures that evolved to keep us safe from immediate physical danger. Here's what this means. On a neurological level, your brain treats imperfection the way it would treat a predator. Mistakes become mortal threats. The stakes of every action become survival itself. This wouldn't be so problematic if the threat response were designed for continuous activation. But it's not. The fight-or-flight response evolved for acute, time-limited emergencies. Your ancestors encountered a lion, the stress response activated, they ran or fought, and then, crucially, the system shut down and they recovered. But perfectionism creates a different situation. Chronic, unremitting activation of stress systems. You're always in danger because you're always falling short. The lion never goes away because the standard is never met. Your body floods with cortisol day after day, week after week, year after year. The consequences are devastating. Chronic stress disrupts sleep architecture, impairs immune function, increases inflammation, damages the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, and rewires neural pathways to make negative thinking more automatic and positive thinking more difficult. Perfectionism doesn't just hurt psychologically, it literally changes your brain in ways that perpetuate suffering. And here's perhaps the cruelest neurological reality. Perfectionism creates a dopamine trap. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with motivation, reward seeking, and pleasure. When you accomplish something, dopamine is released, creating a sense of satisfaction. But in perfectionists, this system is hijacked. The accomplishment threshold keeps rising. What once would have generated satisfaction now generates only temporary relief from anxiety, followed quickly by the next goal, the next standard, the next impossible target. You're running on a hedonic treadmill that speeds up with every step. The horizon of enough recedes endlessly, and the brain, desperate for the dopamine hit it's been conditioned to expect, drives you harder and faster towards something you can never reach. The ecology of shame, how perfectionism feeds on social connection. But we cannot understand perfectionism solely through the lens of individual psychology or neuroscience. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. Our brains developed in the context of groups, tribes, communities. And perfectionism exploits our deepest social needs, particularly our need for belonging. The psychologist Brené Brown has spent decades researching shame, and her findings are illuminating. Shame, she explains, is the intensely painful feeling that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. It's not guilt, I did something bad, but shame, I am something bad. And perfectionism, she argues, is shame's handmaiden. Here's how the mechanism works. As social primates, our survival has always depended on maintaining our place in the group. Exile meant death. Rejection meant vulnerability. So we evolved exquisitely sensitive mechanisms for detecting social threat, for reading faces, interpreting tone, detecting disapproval. We became experts at adjusting our behavior to maintain acceptance. Perfectionism weaponizes this adaptive system. It convinces you that belonging is conditional, that you must earn your place through flawlessness, that any visible flaw will lead to rejection, that your worth is perpetually on trial. It transforms the natural human need for connection into a source of terror. Consider the internal dialogue of shame that perfectionism creates. If they knew the real me, the messy, flawed, struggling me, they would reject me. I must hide my imperfections to maintain the illusion of competence. Any mistake is evidence that I'm a fraud, about to be exposed. I cannot show vulnerability because vulnerability is weakness, and weakness is unacceptable. This dialogue creates a profound loneliness. You cannot truly connect with others if you're always performing, always maintaining a facade, always hiding the parts of yourself you deem unworthy. Perfectionism promises that if you're flawless enough, you'll be loved. But what it actually does is ensure that the real you remains unseen, unknown, isolated, and isolation intensifies perfectionism, creating a vicious cycle. Without genuine connection, without the experience of being loved, despite your flaws, you have no evidence that your fears are unfounded. The shame remains unchallenged, growing in the darkness of secrecy. The digital amplification, perfectionism in the age of performance. And then came the internet. And then came social media. And then came a technological revolution that would amplify perfectionism to unprecedented and psychologically catastrophic levels. Think about what social media fundamentally is. A global stage where everyone performs their highlight reel. It's a curated gallery of perfect moments, perfect bodies, perfect relationships, perfect lives. And you, scrolling through this endless stream of apparent perfection, cannot help but compare. The comparison is automatic, neurological, involuntary. Your brain evolved to assess your position in social hierarchies, and social media hijacks this mechanism with terrifying efficiency. Every post becomes a data point in an implicit ranking system. Every image becomes evidence that everyone else has figured out something you haven't. Every success story of others becomes proof of your inadequacy. But here's what makes it uniquely toxic. None of it is real. The perfect vacation photo doesn't show the argument that preceded it. The flawless selfie doesn't show the 30 rejected shots. The inspiring success post doesn't show the anxiety, failures, and struggles beneath. You're comparing your internal experience, messy, complex, imperfect, with everyone else's external performance, and you're losing a game that was rigged from the start. The research on this is unambiguous and terrifying. Study after study shows correlations between social media use and increases in anxiety, depression, body image issues, and perfectionism, particularly socially prescribed perfectionism, the belief that others demand perfection from you. The more time young people spend on Instagram, TikTok, and similar platforms, the more they report feeling inadequate, worthless, behind. and the platforms are designed to maximize this effect. Algorithms reward engagement, and what generates engagement? Envy. Aspiration, the gap between what you have and what you want. The platforms profit from your insecurity, feeding you an endless stream of content calibrated to make you feel both inspired and inadequate simultaneously. The result is a generation growing up with unprecedented rates of perfectionism, anxiety, and depression. A generation that has learned to treat their lives as brands to be optimized, their selves as products to be marketed, their worth as metrics to be measured in likes, shares, followers. The glass throne has gone viral, and it's cutting deeper than ever before. The perfectionist's toolkit, defense mechanisms, and coping strategies. To survive under the tyranny of perfectionism, the psyche develops elaborate defense mechanisms, strategies for managing the unbearable tension between actual and ideal, between who you are and who you believe you must be. Let's examine the primary mechanisms. Procrastination. If you never finish, you never fail. If you never start, you can maintain the fantasy that you could have been perfect if only you'd had more time. Procrastination is not laziness. It's a terror management strategy. The perfectionist procrastinates not because they don't care, but because they care too much. Avoidance. Why risk imperfection when you can simply opt out? The perfectionist avoids new challenges, relationships, opportunities, anything that might reveal inadequacy. Their life becomes a territory of safety, shrinking year by year. Overwork. If you're exhausted enough, failure can be attributed to circumstances rather than capability. Overwork provides a buffer, an explanation for anything less than perfect that protects the fragile self from the verdict of incompetence. All or nothing thinking. This is the cognitive distortion at perfectionism's core. If it's not perfect, it's worthless. If you're not the best, you're a failure. There is no middle ground, no spectrum, no nuance, only binary extremes of success and catastrophe. Negative filtering. The perfectionist's attention narrows like a spotlight on flaws. A presentation with 99 positive elements and one small error? The perfectionist will ruminate on the error for days. Compliments are dismissed or minimized. Criticism is amplified and generalized. The psychological immune system that allows most people to maintain positive self-regard is compromised, leaving the perfectionist vulnerable to every perceived failure. These mechanisms are not chosen consciously. They emerge automatically, generated by a mind desperately trying to protect itself from shame and maintain some sense of control. But each mechanism comes with tremendous cost. Together they create a life that is smaller, lonelier, more anxious, and more exhausting than it needs to be. And here's the deepest tragedy. The perfectionist is often admired. Society rewards the appearance of perfectionism, the polished exterior, the high achievement, the relentless discipline. What's invisible is the internal cost, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the inability to experience joy, the sense of running forever on a treadmill that leads nowhere. From the outside, the perfectionist looks successful. From the inside, they're drowning. The existential dimension, perfectionism as terror management. But let us go deeper still. Let us examine perfectionism through the lens of existential philosophy and terror management theory, frameworks that help us understand how human beings cope with the fundamental facts of existence. Ernest Becker, in his masterwork, The Denial of Death, argued that human beings are unique in the animal kingdom because we are aware of our own mortality. We know we will die. We know that everything we build will crumble, that everyone we love will be lost, that our existence is finite and fragile. This knowledge creates what Becker called the terror, a primal existential anxiety about meaninglessness and oblivion. How do we cope with this terror? According to Becker, we create what he called immortality projects, symbolic systems that allow us to feel significant permanent, transcendent. We build monuments, we create art, we raise children, we accumulate wealth and status. We tell ourselves stories about our special purpose, our unique contribution, our enduring legacy. Perfectionism, seen through this lens, is a form of terror management. It's an attempt to create a self so flawless, so accomplished, so undeniably valuable that it might transcend the fundamental vulnerability of being human. If you're perfect enough, perhaps death cannot touch you. If you're perfect enough, perhaps meaninglessness cannot claim you. If you're perfect enough, perhaps you matter absolutely, cosmically, eternally. But this strategy is doomed from the start. You cannot perfect your way out of mortality. You cannot achieve your way out of impermanence. You cannot control your way out of uncertainty. The existential facts remain. You are finite, fallible, mortal. And every attempt to deny this through perfectionism only deepens the suffering. The philosophers of existentialism offered a different path. Søren Kierkegaard spoke of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes from recognizing your radical responsibility for creating meaning in a meaningless universe. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that you are not born with a predetermined nature or purpose, but must create yourself through your choices and actions. Martin Heidegger distinguished between authentic and inauthentic existence, authentic being the courage to face death and groundlessness directly, inauthentic being the various ways we flee from this confrontation into conformity and distraction. Perfectionism, from this perspective, is a form of inauthenticity, a flight from the truth of your being. It's an attempt to construct a fixed, ideal self that doesn't exist, while avoiding the fluid, imperfect, vulnerable self that does. It trades the anxiety of freedom for the prison of impossible standards. It trades the terror of meaninglessness for the torture of perpetual inadequacy. The existentialists would say, you cannot find security in perfection because there is no security. The ground beneath your feet is groundless. The meaning of your life is what you make of it, not what you achieve. Your worth is not something to be earned, but something to be claimed. Or better yet, something to recognize was always already there, prior to any achievement or failure. The integration crisis, when perfectionism shatters. And sometimes the tyranny collapses, sometimes the mechanism that has kept someone functioning for years, decades, suddenly fails. Sometimes the perfectionist reaches a breaking point, a crisis so profound that all the defense mechanisms crumble simultaneously. Psychologists call this a breakdown, but Carl Jung had a different term, a breakthrough. The moment when the persona, the mask we show the world, cracks and the shadow, everything we've repressed and denied, erupts into consciousness. Picture this moment. Sarah, our perfectionist from earlier, is preparing for the most important presentation of her career. She has worked on it for months, perfecting every detail, rehearsing every word. The night before, she cannot sleep. She reviews her slides again and again. She notices a minor inconsistency. She tries to fix it. Suddenly she cannot remember what she was going to say. Panic rises. The slides begin to blur. Her heart races. She cannot breathe. And then something breaks. Not the presentation. That will go fine. Mechanically. Numbly. What breaks is the structure itself. The belief that perfection is possible. The faith that if she just tries hard enough, she'll finally be enough. The entire scaffolding of her identity collapses, and underneath she finds emptiness, terror, the raw, undefended reality of her vulnerability. This is the dark night of the soul. This is the crisis that can either destroy or transform. Because when the perfectionist's defenses fail, two paths open. One leads to deeper pathology, perhaps addiction, perhaps depression, perhaps a complete withdrawal from life. The other leads to awakening. Jung believed that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness, what he called individuation. But wholeness cannot be achieved through perfection, only through integration. This means embracing not just the polished, acceptable parts of yourself, but the shadow parts, the parts you've deemed unworthy, the parts you've hidden, the parts you've been at war with. The perfectionist's crisis is an invitation to stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable, good and bad, perfect and worthless. An invitation to befriend your humanity rather than battling it. An invitation to discover that the flaws you've been trying to eliminate are not obstacles to wholeness, but components of it. But this invitation is terrifying, because it means letting go of control. It means accepting uncertainty. It means allowing yourself to be seen in your imperfection and trusting, against every instinct the tyranny has cultivated, that you will still be worthy, still be lovable, still belong. This is the threshold, the moment of maximum danger and maximum possibility, the moment when the glass throne finally shatters and you must decide, will you try to rebuild it, or will you discover that you never needed it at all? The answer lies ahead, in the awakening. But first, we must understand what we're waking up to. Act 3. The Awakening. The Liberation from Impossible Standards. There is a story told in Zen Buddhism about a master and a student. The student comes to the master and says, "Teacher, I have been sitting in meditation for years, trying to achieve enlightenment. Please tell me, how much longer must I practice before I reach the goal?" The master looks at the student and replies, "The question assumes you are somewhere other than where enlightenment is. You are asking how long it will take to arrive at a place where you already are." The student is confused. "But I don't feel enlightened. I'm full of thoughts, emotions, imperfections." The master smiles. "And who told you that enlightenment was the absence of those things?" This story contains the seed of liberation from perfectionism, because perfectionism is founded on a fundamental lie, the lie that you are deficient, that something is missing, that you need to become someone other than who you are to be acceptable, lovable, enough. But what if the opposite is true? What if you are always whole, and perfectionism is simply the story you tell yourself that prevents you from recognizing this wholeness? This is not positive thinking or wishful affirmation. This is a radical reorientation of perspective that has been discovered independently by mystics, philosophers, and psychologists across cultures and centuries. The Buddhists call it original nature. The Christians call it grace. The psychologists call it unconditional positive regard. The poets call it the eternal yes. The insight is this: your worth is not conditional. It was never conditional. It cannot be earned because it cannot be lost. You do not have value because of what you achieve, or how you perform, or who you become. You have value because you exist, because you are consciousness experiencing itself, because you are life becoming aware of itself. Everything else, all the standards, all the judgments, all the measures of worthiness are constructions, stories, agreements that society made up and you internalized. They are real in their consequences, but they are not fundamentally true. You are not a project to be perfected. You are a process unfolding, and the unfolding is the point. The paradigm shift from perfectionism to excellence. But let us be clear about what this awakening does and does not mean. The liberation from perfectionism is not the abandonment of standards, the rejection of growth, or the embrace of mediocrity. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding, and it keeps many people trapped in the tyranny, believing that the only alternative to perfectionism is slovenly complacency. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is a profound difference between perfectionism and the pursuit of excellence, and understanding this difference is essential to liberation. Perfectionism says, "I must be flawless or I'm worthless." Excellence says, I will do my best with what I have right now. Perfectionism is about destination. Excellence is about direction. Perfectionism is about comparison. Excellence is about contribution. Perfectionism is motivated by fear. Excellence is motivated by love. Love of craft, love of growth, love of the work itself. Perfectionism says, mistakes are evidence of failure. Excellence says, mistakes are information for improvement. Perfectionism is rigid. Excellence is adaptive. Perfectionism avoids risk. Excellence embraces it. Perfectionism needs external validation. Excellence is intrinsically rewarding. The master craftsman does not create beauty by obsessing over perfection. They create beauty by developing their skill over years, by learning from errors, by embracing the grain of the wood and the flow of the clay, by working with the material rather than trying to dominate it. They understand that excellence is not the elimination of imperfection, but the skillful integration of limitation. The Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi captures this beautifully. It's an appreciation of beauty that is imperfect, impermanent, incomplete. A cracked tea bowl is not seen as flawed, but as bearing the marks of its history, its use, its life. The asymmetry in a garden is not corrected but celebrated. The roughness of handmade pottery is valued precisely because it reveals the human hand. This worldview does not accept mediocrity. The finest practitioners of wabi-sabi spend lifetimes honing their craft. But their craft includes acceptance of imperfection as part of beauty, not as its opposite. They have reconciled the pursuit of mastery with the fact of mortality, limitation, change. This is what awakening looks like in practice. The ability to strive without self-torture, to improve without self-rejection, to set high standards without making your worth conditional on meeting them. The practice of self-compassion, befriending your humanity. But how does one actually move from perfectionism to this liberated way of being? Insight alone is not sufficient. The neural pathways of self-criticism are deeply carved after years of practice. The habit of judgment is automatic. Awakening requires not just understanding, but retraining, a systematic cultivation of a different relationship with yourself. This is where the practice of self-compassion becomes essential. Kristin Neff, the psychologist who has done groundbreaking research in this area, defines self-compassion as having three core components: self-kindness versus self-judgment, treating yourself with the same warmth, understanding, and support that you would offer a close friend. When you fail or suffer, instead of harsh criticism, you offer comfort. Common humanity versus isolation, recognizing that imperfection, failure, and suffering are part of the shared human experience, not evidence that you're uniquely flawed. Everyone struggles. Everyone makes mistakes. You are not alone. Mindfulness versus over-identification, holding your painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness, neither suppressing them nor being consumed by them. Observing your experience without immediately trying to fix or eliminate it. What's remarkable about self-compassion is that it accomplishes what perfectionism promises but cannot deliver. Research shows that self-compassionate people actually have higher standards than self-critical people, but they're more likely to persist in the face of failure, more resilient after setbacks, more willing to take risks, and, crucially, less anxious and depressed. Why? Because self-compassion creates psychological safety. When you know that making a mistake won't result in vicious self-attack, you're free to try things that might not work. When you know that failure doesn't mean you're a failure, you can learn from it rather than being crushed by it. When you treat yourself with kindness, you have the emotional resources to keep growing rather than collapsing in shame. Self-compassion is not self-esteem. Self-esteem in modern culture often means feeling good about yourself because you're special, better than others, achieving highly. It's conditional and comparative, which makes it fundamentally unstable. Self-compassion, by contrast, is stable precisely because it's not based on comparison or achievement. It's based on your humanity, which cannot be lost. The practice begins simply. When you notice self-criticism arising, pause. Place your hand over your heart. Feel the warmth of your own touch. And say to yourself, out loud if possible, something like, "This is hard. I'm struggling right now. May I be kind to myself? May I give myself the compassion I need?" It will feel awkward at first. It may even feel ridiculous or fraudulent. That's normal. You're rewiring neural pathways that have been reinforcing criticism for years. But with practice, something extraordinary happens. The harsh inner voice begins to soften. The automatic judgment begins to loosen. Space opens up between stimulus and response, space where choice becomes possible. The alchemy of imperfection, turning wounds into wisdom. But there is something even deeper available in the awakening, something the Japanese call kintsukuroi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, kintsukuroi makes them part of the beauty. The vessel is not just repaired, but transformed, made more beautiful for having been broken. This is the alchemy of imperfection, the recognition that your flaws, failures, and wounds are not obstacles to your wholeness, but portals to it. That the broken places can become the most luminous places if you're willing to turn toward them rather than away. Carl Jung spoke of this when he wrote about the integration of the shadow. The shadow is everything you've rejected about yourself, not just negative qualities like anger or selfishness, but often positive qualities that didn't fit your family's or culture's expectations. The perfectionist shadow is vast, containing all the spontaneity, messiness, vulnerability, and wild creativity that got exiled in service of the polished persona. But integration is not about eliminating the shadow. It's about bringing it into relationship, into dialogue, into the wholeness of who you are. When you do this, when you turn toward the rejected parts with curiosity rather than judgment, something alchemical occurs. The energy that was trapped in repression becomes available. The qualities you feared become sources of strength. The wounds become wisdom. I have seen this in my own journey, and in the journeys of countless others who have navigated the passage from perfectionism to wholeness. The person who was paralyzed by fear of public speaking discovered that their sensitivity, which they had judged as weakness, made them a profound communicator. The person who was ashamed of their emotional intensity discovered it was the source of their artistic power. The person who hated their body discovered in it a capacity for pleasure and presence they had never allowed themselves. What we reject, we empower. What we resist persists, but what we embrace transforms. The perfectionist lives in a constant state of war with parts of themselves. The awakened person recognizes that peace comes not through victory but through integration, through welcoming home all the exiled parts and discovering that they were never the enemy, only aspects of wholeness calling to be recognized. The technology of transformation, rewiring the perfectionist brain. But awakening is not merely philosophical or psychological, it's also neurological. And this is where modern neuroscience offers profound hope because we now know something our ancestors did not. The brain is plastic. It can change. The neural pathways of perfectionism can be rewired. This is called neuroplasticity, and it means that the same mechanism that carved the patterns of self-criticism can carve new patterns of self-compassion. Every time you respond to a mistake with kindness instead of criticism, you strengthen one neural pathway and weaken another. Every time you notice a self-judgment and choose differently, you are literally reshaping your brain. The practices are specific and powerful. Meditation, regular meditation practice, even 10 minutes a day, has been shown to increase cortical thickness in areas associated with attention and emotional regulation, while reducing activity in the amygdala, the fear center. It creates space between thought and reaction, allowing you to observe the critic's voice without identifying with it. Cognitive restructuring. This is the practice of noticing cognitive distortions, all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, filtering, and consciously generating alternative interpretations. Not to deny reality, but to see it more accurately. The perfectionist's mind distorts toward the negative. Restructuring restores balance. Behavioral experiments. Deliberately doing things imperfectly and observing what actually happens versus what you feared would happen. Sending the email with a minor typo. Posting the creative work before it's ready. Having the conversation without rehearsing. Each experiment provides evidence that imperfection is not catastrophic, gradually eroding the fear. Somatic practices. Because perfectionism lives in the body as much as the mind, as chronic tension, shallow breathing, clenched muscles, practices that work directly with the body can be profoundly liberating. Yoga, dance, breathwork, even simply pausing to notice sensation can help release the stored stress and reconnect you with the wisdom of the body. What's crucial to understand is that transformation is not a singular moment of enlightenment, but a practice, repeated, consistent, imperfect. You will not wake up one day and discover perfectionism has vanished. You will wake up and practice responding differently, and then wake up the next day and practice again. And gradually, over time, the new response becomes more automatic than the old one. The voice of kindness becomes louder than the voice of criticism. This is how consciousness reshapes itself, through attention, intention, and repetition, through the patient, imperfect work of becoming who you always were beneath the tyranny. The collective awakening, transforming the culture of perfectionism. But individual awakening, while essential, is not sufficient, because perfectionism is not merely a personal affliction, it's a cultural one. It's embedded in our institutions, our economic systems, our social media platforms, our collective narratives about success and worth. To truly liberate ourselves, we need not just individual healing, but collective transformation. We need to examine and challenge the systems that generate perfectionism in the first place. This means questioning the educational systems that rank children, that treat learning as competition rather than exploration, that prioritize test scores over curiosity and creativity. It means examining workplace cultures that demand constant availability, that measure worth by productivity, that sacrifice human well-being for efficiency. It means confronting the advertising and social media industries that profit from our insecurity, that engineer envy, that create impossible beauty standards, and then sell us the products that promise to bridge the gap. It means demanding technology that enhances human connection rather than exploiting human vulnerability. It means reimagining success itself, not as individual achievement measured by wealth, status, and power, but as collective flourishing measured by meaning, connection, and contribution. Not as a zero-sum competition where some must lose for others to win, but as a collaborative creation of conditions where everyone can thrive. This is not utopian fantasy. This is practical necessity. The data is overwhelming. Perfectionism is increasing, particularly among young people, and it's not making us more productive or successful. It's making us sick. Rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide are rising in direct correlation with rises in perfectionism. Our current cultural system is psychologically unsustainable. But transformation is possible. We've seen it before in other domains. We've shifted collective consciousness around smoking, around seatbelts, around numerous issues that once seemed intractable. Culture can change, and it changes through the aggregation of individual choices, through shifts in what we value and what we refuse to tolerate. Every time you refuse to participate in the performance of perfection on social media, you weaken that system. Every time you show up authentically, vulnerably, imperfectly, you give others permission to do the same. Every time you choose connection over comparison, contribution over competition, being overdoing, you are participating in the collective awakening. You are not just healing yourself, you are healing the culture, the ultimate liberation, living as process, not product. And now we arrive at the deepest truth, the ultimate liberation that awaits on the other side of perfectionism, the recognition that you are not a product to be perfected, but a process to be lived. Western culture, particularly in its modern capitalist expression, treats human beings as projects. You have a self, and that self needs to be optimized, upgraded, improved. There is always a better version of you waiting to be achieved through the right routine, the right diet, the right habits, the right mindset. You are, in essence, a startup, and life is about maximizing your ROI. But what if this entire framework is wrong? What if you are not a thing at all, but a happening? Not a noun, but a verb? The philosopher Alan Watts explored this extensively. He pointed out that we don't say, "it thinks" or "it lives." We say, "I think" and "I live." But this grammatical structure is misleading. It implies that there is an I that has thoughts and life, a subject that possesses experiences. But what if there is only thinking, living, experiencing? What if the I is not the owner, but the activity itself? You are not a person who breathes, you are breathing happening. You are not a person who feels, you are feeling happening. You are not a separate entity navigating existence. You are existence experiencing itself from this particular perspective for this particular moment. When you see yourself as process rather than product, perfectionism loses its foundation because a process cannot be perfect, it can only unfold. A river is not trying to be a perfect river, it's simply flowing. A tree is not trying to be a perfect tree, it's simply growing, shaped by soil and sun and season, never the same from moment to moment. And you're growing, changing, flowing, unfolding. Some days you are a roaring waterfall, some days you are a quiet stream. Sometimes you are clear, sometimes you are muddy. None of these states is more correct than the others. They are all expressions of the same ongoing process. This doesn't mean abandoning direction or intention. Rivers have direction. Trees grow toward light, but they do so without self-torture, without judgment, without the notion that they should be other than they are in this moment. This is the ultimate paradox that the perfectionist cannot grasp. Change happens most naturally when you stop insisting on it. Growth occurs most powerfully when you stop forcing it. You become who you're meant to be, not by rejecting who you are, but by fully inhabiting it. The glass throne shatters completely, and in its place you discover something far more precious. The simple, radical permission to be human, to be imperfect, to be in process, to be alive. Conclusion and the new beginning. And so we have traveled together through the labyrinth. From the moment consciousness became self-aware and learned to judge itself, through the centuries of philosophy and religion that elevated the ideal above the real, through the industrial and digital revolutions that weaponized comparison and performance, through the psychological mechanisms that keep the tyranny in place, through the neurological and social architecture of suffering, and finally to the awakening, the recognition that you were always whole, that perfection was never the goal, that your liberation lies not in becoming someone else, but in fully being yourself. But this journey does not end here. Awakening is not a destination. It's a beginning. Every day you will be invited to choose again. Will you listen to the voice that demands perfection, or the voice that offers compassion? Will you measure your worth by your achievements, or recognize that worth is inherent? Will you live as a project to be optimized, or as a process to be experienced? The tyranny has not disappeared. The cultural forces that generate perfectionism are still operative. Your neural pathways of self-criticism are still there, ready to activate. You will still make mistakes. still fall short, still struggle. The difference is that now you know. These moments are not evidence of deficiency, but opportunities for choice, opportunities to practice a different way, opportunities to return again and again to your humanity. And here is what I want you to know as you move forward. Your imperfection is not a problem to solve, it is a reality to embrace. It is what makes you human, what connects you to everyone who has ever lived, what gives your life its texture and depth and beauty. Your mistakes are not shameful secrets to hide. They are teachers, showing you where growth is possible, where adjustment is needed, where you are still learning. Every error is an invitation to deeper understanding. Your vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage. It is the foundation of connection, creativity, and change. Only by allowing yourself to be seen in your imperfection can you experience genuine belonging. Your worth is not conditional. It never was. It is not something you earn through achievement or lose through failure. It is the ground of your being, as fundamental as existence itself. You matter because you are, not because of what you do. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki wrote, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement. Hold both truths simultaneously. You are complete and in process. You are enough and evolving. You are perfect as you are and growing into who you will become. There is no contradiction here, only the paradox of being human. The path forward is not about eliminating imperfection, but transforming your relationship with it. It's about meeting yourself with the kindness you would offer a beloved friend. It's about recognizing that the harshness you've directed inward was learned, not inherent, and what was learned can be unlearned. It's about patience with the pace of your unfolding, trust in the wisdom of your process, and compassion for the parts of you that are still afraid. The invitation. So here's my invitation to you. What if you chose, just for today, to be imperfect on purpose? What if you sent the email without triple checking it, posted the creative work before it was ready, had the conversation without rehearsing, tried something you might fail at? What if you chose, just for today, to speak to yourself the way you speak to someone you love? To notice the self-criticism when it arises and respond with gentleness? To treat your struggles with compassion rather than contempt? What if you chose, just for today, to measure your worth not by what you accomplish, but by how fully you show up? Not by how flawlessly you perform, but by how authentically you connect? Not by the distance you've traveled, but by the courage it takes to keep walking? And then, tomorrow, what if you chose it again, and again, and again? This is how transformation happens. Not through dramatic revelation, but through small, repeated choices. Not through perfection, but through practice. Not through becoming someone new, but through slowly remembering who you always were, beneath the tyranny. The glass throne has shattered. The shards lie glittering on the ground, catching light, beautiful in their brokenness. You do not need to sit above your humanity. You need to live within it. Messy, imperfect, struggling, growing, alive. The tyranny whispered that you were not enough. But the truth is this: you have always been enough. You are enough right now, reading these words, with all your flaws and fears and beautiful imperfections. You are enough not because of what you've achieved, but because you are consciousness experiencing itself, life becoming aware, the universe looking back at itself in wonder. You are not a problem to solve, you are a mystery to live, and the greatest adventure is not becoming perfect, it's becoming whole. The final paradox. So let me leave you with one last paradox, one last question to carry with you. What would your life look like if you lived as though you were already free? If you treated your imperfection not as a curse but as a gift? If you embraced your humanity not as a limitation, but as your most profound expression of existence? What would you create? What would you risk? Who would you love? How would you move through the world if you knew deeply that you were always already whole? You don't have to answer this question now. Let it work in you. Let it plant itself in the soil of your consciousness and grow in its own time, at its own pace, because you are not a project to be completed. You are a garden to be tended with patience, with care, with love. And gardens grow best not when forced toward perfection, but when allowed to unfold according to their own beautiful, imperfect nature. The journey continues, the awakening deepens, the transformation unfolds. And you are exactly where you need to be, imperfect, alive and free. Welcome home. If this journey resonated with you, if you felt something shift, if you recognized yourself in these words, you are not alone. Millions are waking up to the tyranny of perfectionism and choosing liberation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let's create a culture where imperfection is not shameful, but human, where vulnerability is not weakness, but courage, where we measure success not by flawlessness, but by authenticity, connection, and growth. The collective awakening is underway, and your participation matters. Until next time, be kind to yourself. You're doing better than you think.